Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, but today we are joined once again by a very special guest. If you watched The Kingdom of Spiro, A Forgotten Civilization, you already know who he is. Those of you that loved that episode are going to thoroughly enjoy this one. And without further ado, Dr. Eric Singleton, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
For those who may not be familiar with who you are and what you do, would you mind telling our audience a little bit about yourself?
My name is Eric Singleton. I'm the Curator of Ethnology at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, and I study Native American history and culture. That is pretty much from the pre-Columbian period in North America and also Latin or Mesoamerica, but also the historic period in North America. So I really just enjoy almost every aspect of Indigenous culture, from art to activities to cultural events to historic period history to pre-Columbian iconography. And that was really the basis of the exhibit I just completed at the museum. Spiro and the Art of the Mississippian World was kind of utilizing archaeological evidence, historic evidence, oral traditions, artwork, and conversations with community members to try to kind of get an idea of what occurred at the Spiro Mounds nearly 600 years ago. And so it was a very holistic approach and I think extremely informative.
What we're going to talk about today is a subject that many of you requested. Many of you enjoy studying religions before the modern era. And after the success of the Kingdom of Spiro and seeing that many of you truly wanted to learn more about Native American history, I thought that exploring Mississippian religion was the next logical step for us to go. And so without further ado, we're going to take you on a journey back through time to a world that, it seemed forgotten by so many for so long, that's slowly coming back alive. And without further ado, we're going to take you there. Let's briefly talk about geography. When it comes to the ancient Mississippian world, what territory expanse are we actually looking at?
You know, it's hard to say exactly, but you're essentially looking at the entire eastern half of North America, from the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast. Really, I'd say the Great Lakes down to Florida. Now, there's going to be some divisions there between some of the cultural groups. It's not necessarily in the Northeast. It's not exactly on the Great Lakes, but there's definitely communication. There's groups moving in and out of these regions and onto the Great Plains. And the Great Plains is really important because a lot of people start thinking about that areas being inhabited by nomadic indigenous people with the horse and the teepee. And the truth is that's just not the case. The Wichita people, the Pawnee, the Hidatsa, the Arikara, they've been living on the plains for thousands of years in giant cities that in many cases incorporated populations nearly 20,000. So these were highly trafficked and utilized landscapes, and it was the westernmost periphery of what we call the Mississippian period.
Are there any related religions due to migrations of populations or influence from one group to another, much like in the Old World, where the Indo Europeans spread in migration and with that spread their culture and religion as well? With that question, I'd like us to frame that towards ancient North America and the Mississippians. In your opinion, did something like that take place?
That's a great question and a really difficult one to ask. I might first start by saying, I started thinking about this instead of New World and Old World as a clash of two old worlds. And then you look at an American world and then you look at everyone else. Because the people here go back, I would argue, nearly 40,000 years. And so you're looking at a cultural evolution that has been around and equal to any other nation and community in the world. And with the transference of belief, it's hard to say who influenced who. Now, when Europeans first got here, they were first contacted or first came into contact with Mesoamerican cultures that we know of as the Maya and the Aztecs. And they had these large ceremonial sites, or they're cities, really. And for Tenochtitlan, you're looking at a population of 300,000 sitting in the center of that lake. And they also built in stone. So you have these cultural creations that are still there today because they built in stone, where in North America, they built in wood and earth. But the Mississippian people, who were ever bit as much masters of architecture and art and culture, because they built with what would be more organic substances, it's just not there. So we always look at them because those are the groups that the Europeans first came into contact with, and the Mississippians had declined by that time as being the dominant cultural force. But the Aztecs actually came down from North America. So the Aztecs are a Ute Aztecan group, which we call the Chichimecas. They came in and took over the entire Valley of Mexico. Those are North Americans. So really, the question is, did it move north or did it move south? And I would argue that what you're probably looking at is a religious structure that goes back thousands of years and probably came over with some of the first people in North America. And then that same religion just continued to evolve. The same concept is really seen in North, Central, and South America. With the belief in what we call a tri-layered universe with an above, middle, and below world, but there are tiers within that. And so it's really hard to say, but what you would get is, I would say, changes and concepts that evolved as people came into contact with each other via trade. In North America alone, we're looking at the shell from Sea of Cortez, the Gulf of California, copper that comes from the Great Lakes, whelk shells that come from the Florida Keys, mineral and other things that would have come from the Valley of Mexico. So you have a huge trade network, and feathers. And so the transference of ideas is going to go back and forth. So it's really a difficult question, but I would say it's worth saying that I don't know, but there is a lot of cultural overlap, and there is a lot of similarities in North, Central, and South America. So it's really hard to say chicken and the egg.
What were important religious sites? How did they look? And how do they correspond to other ancient sites around the Americas or the world?
That's a great question, too, because I think it's kind of understanding what is a religious site and what is religion here in North America. And I think it's important to acknowledge that religion and reality are the same thing. And so religion is just a part of daily life. And so when we start looking at these sites and cities, we see that there are pyramid structures built in there where you have religious leaders acting upon the world from those locations. But you also see when Europeans get here and you see kind of the upheaval of traditional lifeways, that many groups are actually moving into other communities and adapting almost instantaneously. And that's because of that shared common religious belief. But you do see sites that are kind of connected to geography. And it's really, we just call it sacred geography. You see it in the historic period with the Kiowa and the Lakota, who both accepted the Black Hills are their origin. And so the Black Hills are sacred landscapes. When the Kiowa moved down, you have landscapes in Oklahoma that take on that. Rivers can take on that. I think many of the Mississippian sites themselves are probably connected to sacred geography and probably connected to the cosmos and the night sky. And that's just a thought, but it seems to be one that would probably make a lot of sense. And for example, Moundville in Alabama at 1400, when most of the Mississippian world is collapsing, turns into an ossuary. And so that in and of itself, if it wasn't before, becomes a sacred site. But I suspect it was before. And I think it was probably a site connected with the underworld.
Are there any names from the religion or religions that can be seen in the names of landmarks, rivers, towns, or counties?
I think that the case would probably be yes, but I don't exactly know of them. Most of the names that we use, and coming from Oklahoma, there is a ton. And they're more related to cultural groups, societies, and people's names. Sometimes it's a name that one group might have given another group. It's maybe one group and how they actually called themselves. And so the answer is probably yes, but I can't point to any specific one. But there are certainly names that people would have associated with rivers, certain features within a river that might be connected to supernatural characters or entrances to the underworld, but those translating into today's vocabulary, maybe not so, not in a very popular way.
I'd like to talk about European sources on the ancient Mississippians and their surrounding world, and even other surrounding peoples. Have these sources had anything to say on these peoples? And if so, are those accounts reliable?
Absolutely. You have elders in the community, and you have the passing down of oral tradition. And you have in the Americas one of the finest oral traditions, I would argue, in the world. And this is why it goes back so far, and history goes back so far. So, for instance, when I took my PhD comps, I had 5 professors sitting in a room, grilling me, making sure that I knew what I was talking about and asking questions. And in a community like this, before you would join a society or a particular group, imagine 20 or 30, and you'd be getting it right. Because, like I said before, religion and reality are the same thing. Therefore, you can't separate the two. That means what you do in reality is affected and affects the supernatural realm. And so it's very important that you get these things right. And so it's critical for how the world remains in balance. And, we start talking, prior, we kind of mentioned the fact that, so many Europeans like to call it culture. But, the reality is there was a very symbiotic relationship in the world. So I would say that there's probably a much better understanding of the natural world here in the Americas than anywhere else in the world. In fact, I would actually argue that America was Eden before Europeans came and took it over. You don't have any disease here. You have a perfect amino acid in corn, beans, and squash. And yeah, you have warfare, but beyond that, you basically have a perfect symbiotic relationship with the environment. And it's just a wondrous place. I would love to have seen it. But a little off topic. So back to the original question. In addition to folklore and oral traditions, what you have are early European accounts, and that would be De Soto narratives. One of the best are the government agents that actually dictated notes of what they saw. But then in the 1600s, you have Alexander Long document, and you can find that online. But the original is at the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa. And that was descriptions with the Cherokee people, where he wrote down their religious practices, instances of what eclipses mean, and the underwater serpent, and all these supernatural characters. But then you have William Bartram and his conversations with the Muskogee people, conversations with the Natchez, the Choctaw. You have the Codex Canadiensis, which you can find online as well, which is a French Jesuit priest named Louis Nichols, who was in Canada in the late 1600s, and he wrote down notes of interactions he had, conversations he had. Marquette did the same thing. So yeah, a lot of this information has been recorded. Now you have to sift through some of it, because a lot of times what you find is people in a new environment and not really understanding what they're seeing. Also, translations errors. And so that's probably why you see subtle differences in descriptions. But once you weed through a lot of that, there's a really clear understanding of a general concept that permeated the religious world here. And there are subtle differences based off landscape and need. But for the most part, there is a very common ideology, and that is translated through folklore or oral traditions today, folklore, and early European documentation actions with indigenous people. And that continued all the way up into George Catlin. And so he described the Okipa ceremony, and to a very good, the best he really could have. As unbiased as anyone truly could have been in certain situations. So yeah, whole lot of primary sources. I mean, one of the things with the Spanish documents is keep in mind that when the Europeans came here, especially with the Spanish, that you have some narratives in the De Soto Chronicle that were rather outlandish. And that's because you have a group of people that truly did not understand what they were seeing, and they were doing the best they could, in my mind, to probably cope with a very strange and foreign realm. Other documentations were government chronicles. Now, the government chronicles are rather accurate because what you're essentially seeing is they're taking inventory because they viewed this as government property, and this is the new kingdom of Spain. And so they're going into towns and they're counting to a very accurate degree the population, the amount of statues, the landscape, who the people are, again, because they're taking inventory. So the government documents for the early Spanish chronicles can be very exacting. The same with Louis Nichols. When they're going in, some of these priests, when they're going into these environments, some are very outlandish because they're very focused in on conversion. Other people are in these environments because they're taking stock, they're taking inventory. How many people do we need to convert? What is it going to take, and what do they believe? And they're trying to kind of get their minds around that before they send in missionaries.
We've covered geography, we've covered sources, and we've covered the placement of religious sites. And so now I would like to turn this to the ancient Mississippians themselves and talk about their religious views and the narratives within the religions of the Mississippian world. Do we know how they viewed the afterlife? How did they view the soul?
That's a really tough question because I think that maybe conversations about souls or, even in, let's go back to, the Abrahamic faith can probably be rather personal, even though they're shrouded in a very large religious doctrine and dogma. But we do know that there was the concept of rebirth here in the Americas. So there is a soul, there's a concept of a soul. There's also souls associated with animals, and that in many cases, animals would be reincarnated into the form of another animal or to the same animal again. But also there was the need to properly take certain actions to make sure that soul did not inhabit or haunt a human or living entity. So yeah, there's a lot of very careful preparations associated with not only killing, but the afterlife. And so, yeah, there's a lot of complexity to that question. I would say, yes, it's there. We do know that there is the concept of rebirth. I can't say for sure that it's tied to these same concepts of reincarnation, but it's the rebirth of soul. Even going back to the ancient Olmec in Mesoamerica, well, there's these Olmec babies. Well, what you're really looking at that, because they're non-gendered statuary, is you're probably looking at ancestor vessels. And that's where the soul of the ancestor would reside. And so a lot of peoples in the Americas were, they worshiped ancestors. It was an ancestor worshipped practice. And so they were there as part of the living world in some capacity, viewed as what we would call ghosts, perhaps, but they were an active part of the world.
What were the most important religious symbols? And again, how do they compare to symbols from other religions, if we even know?
That's a really good one. We do know that there were symbols in the Mississippian realm that related to the above, middle, and below world. And so the entire Mississippian belief system is kind of focused on a trilayered universe. Now, that above world is inhabited by the lords of thunder and lightning. It's almost a sense of perfection. It's characters that are larger than life, that are bigger, that really kind of create balance in the world. Then there's the realm in which we exist, and then the underworld, which is inhabited by animals and creatures that are in water and are accessed through caves. And so to see these symbols, what they really point out is that these realms are connected to symbols. So when you see a cross, what you're really looking at is the four cardinal directions, but you're also looking at a symbol for the sacred fire. So the cross in and of itself is a representative image of the world in which we reside. When you look at the sun, and you see this in various motifs, that is a representation of the above world, in the world in which the thunders and the lords of thunder and lightning reside. When you see swirl patterns, that is connected to whirlpools, which is the entrance, one of many, but an entrance to the underworld. And that's because, it's in the water associated with the underworld, and probably because whirlpools would have pulled people. You can see these same motifs worldwide, and that's probably because they're very easy to produce. There may be, a common religious element that goes back 60 to 100, maybe 200,000 years, if not further. But you also have to acknowledge the fact that people are responding inherently with religion is a way for people to respond to and accept the world in which they live. So the concept of a cross, the concept of a whirlpool may be inherent to cultures across the world because it's a feature seen across the world. For instance, we call it a swirl pattern, but just for our audience here, I will say it resembles what we've come, unfortunately, to know as the swastika. And that is a bent cross motif. Now, in the Buddhist cultures, that's a symbol of positive. It was seen in ancient America here in the Navajo realm, as well as in the Mississippian realm. It's seen in ancient Tibet in the Middle East. And so what you saw was a single madman who took a single image and then made people view it on his terms and then said, wherever you see this, it's because we created it. Well, the truth is he adapted it from everyone else in the world. And so symbols do have power. And so you do see certain symbols connected all over the world. And that's because you're seeing similar features probably all over the world. Here, though, symbols are connected to supernatural realms and given features of the environment.
Being someone who studies ancient European history and even the history of the ancient Near East, we see various peoples, civilizations, and cultures with a pantheon of deities. The Celts, for example, had so many gods and goddesses that I question if we'll ever actually know all of their names. And so with that kind of focus, I want to shift that towards the Americas, towards North America, and ask, when it comes to religion in the ancient Mississippian world, did they also have similar pantheons, or is it completely different here?
I would think that you could say yes, that you have a pantheon. You have what was called in the Muskogee people, the master of breath or the master of life. The Pawnee have a similar deity, and most people here, I believe, all share this common deity. And this individual, almost similar to the Abrahamic faith and others across the world, is a deity that resides beyond knowledge and understanding. It is life itself. It is the universe. And then from that individual or that creature was created the pantheon. And so that's where Earth Mother comes into play, Morning Star, Birdman, as well as the underwater creatures. And so that was the process in which the world, and I include the supernatural realm as well in that, was birthed. Unfortunately, because of what happened with the European contact and the genocide that occurred here, connected to both war and disease, we've lost a lot of that information. But when you look at the Maya, when you look at the Aztecs, when you look at North America, you have a pantheon of deities. Probably the most famous is the Aztec. You have Quetzalcoatl, but you also have Xipe Totec, who was the flayed one. And so that's just two instances. And there would have been a multitude of others, male, female, but also animal, that would have come to play a part in this.
We had touched briefly on the cosmos in the ancient Mississippian world. Many of our subscribers had said they would love to know more about cosmology, the cosmos, in the ancient Mississippian world. Would you mind expanding for us today and giving us a little insight into that aspect of this study?
So the belief system here in the Americas, again, goes back to this tri-layered universe. But one aspect of that is not only the day sky, but the night sky. And so when we talk about the underworld, we're not just talking about an underworld realm, but we're talking about the flipping of day and night. So everything here is about duality. And so the underworld, what we see is it becomes the night sky. And so you see a lot of things connected to the stars. You see a lot of things connected to constellations. And so, for instance, you have what we call Orion, was actually a hand motif, and it was referenced by the hand. And so Orion becomes an entrance into the Milky Way, and the Milky Way is where the soul goes after it dies. And along this journey, you have the old woman who sits in a lodge, and there is these interactions and repeated interactions that they would have with different deities and different supernatural characters after death in order to actually move into the afterworld. But also you have, I believe, exits from the afterworld. So if you have a concept of rebirth, then if you have an entrance to the afterlife, you actually need an exit. And I believe the constellations played a part there. Working with various communities too, you see that there's conversations with that they might have concerning, let's say, Bigfoot, a mythical creature here in the Americas. But there's documentation going back to the 1600s and 1700s, both by European and indigenous people, talking about this very hairy, large creature. And a lot of indigenous people have communicated that he'll never be found because of his ability to actually disappear, to actually utilize these portals. One example of that is on the pipe that they call Big Boy, or is Red Horn, or he who wears human heads in his ears, also known as Morning Star. That was in the Spiro exhibit. It's a very famous piece. Well, sitting on his head is a pallet. If you turn him sideways, that is a pallet. And that pallet in and of itself shows him as a portal keeper. He has the ability to move between realms, the above, the middle, and the below realm. But what you also see is that being a diamond pattern. And I think more than just a diamond pattern, I see connections to females. And I think women play a much larger role here in Mississippian religious cosmology and religion than is typically discussed. They play a much larger role, and there's a portal element there. You also have the old woman who never dies, or Earth Mother, connected not only with corn, but to, more importantly, rebirth. And again, associated with women. The ability for rebirth comes through women. That's a very important topic to discuss here. Is the not only relationship of women to the supernatural, but their role in societies. I mean, they play a very, very important role in society.
We know that the Mississippians were extremely interconnected with the world and other societies around them, and that there were extensive trade routes throughout the Americas. And so I wanted to ask, do we see a Mississippian impact and influence on surrounding societies in terms of religious practices and art?
Yes, I'd say that you would. And I think that it's just a natural thing that any community, anywhere in the world is not going to be completely isolated. And that via trade or via contact with other groups, you're going to have a transference of ideas and material associated with those ideas that moves into different regions. By the same vein, you see pieces from across what we call the known world showing up here. And so through trade and through contact, you definitely are going to see a change in ideas. Now, it's not significant in that, do you see a lot of Mesoamerican pieces here in North America? No. But you don't see a lot of North American pieces down in the Meso realm. But you do have, speaking with the Pawnee and speaking with the Kickapoo, they're talking about going all the way down into the Yucatan. There's stories and mythologies about them interacting with little people, and these little people have tails. They're monkeys. This is happening all the time. People are constantly moving. And, I don't think that there's anything to say, just because you're not finding an extensive collection of material in a given location doesn't mean there's no contact. For example, the Chinese were in contact with everyone around them, but in and of itself, they're Chinese. So they're not having to collect other stuff because they have their own cultural beliefs, artistic styles, and everything else. So there's not really a need to collect material. And that doesn't mean that Chinese are not having an impact or being impacted by others. Same with Islamic art. Well, Islamic art is going everywhere. It's pushing out, but it's also adapting and bringing in. But based off religious and also cultural taboos, they're not integrating a lot of this stuff into their artwork. They're adapting, they're creating, and in my opinion, they have some of the most beautiful art in the world. For anyone who's never been to the Alhambra Mosque, go. And so, another example of that may be that Spain, for 800 years, was controlled by Islamic peoples. And it was a very peaceful culture. 800 years. That's nearly 3 times longer than the United States formed. All of a sudden, the Christians come back into the fold. But that's a lot to adapt and to take on. But you see primarily now, people always just talk about the Christian element.
I want to now approach religious practices. I'd like to ask, when it comes to the ancient Mississippians, ancient Mississippian religion, do we know anything about their customs and maybe even religious practices?
We do know some, through the archaeological record. So earlier I'd mentioned Moundville, and that Moundville turns into an ossuary. Well, we know that that's associated with religious practices. We can see it in the creation of the large platform mounds that were created all over the eastern half of North America. We also see it specifically at Spiro. So one of the purposes behind the exhibition on Spiro was to really ask the question of why Spiro, and why was Spiro the location of what would be the largest assemblage of Mississippian religious material ever found in North America. Spiro, you could argue, was probably one of the smallest Mississippian cities, yet it had the largest single context of Mississippian religious goods ever found. And so that question is why. And so you start kind of thinking, back to the folklore, back to the histories, back to European accounts, back to conversations with elders, and you start kind of putting this into shape. And you see that I think that this is probably associated with a revitalization movement, and one that you see connected to the closest and probably most popular is the ghost dance. And so the ghost dance was occurred in the late 1800s by a Paiute leader named Wovoka. And he argued that by utilizing certain song and incantation, ritual objects and outfits, that if you danced in the appropriate way for 7 days, that you would, in essence, restart time. You would get rid of all the white people, you would bring back the buffalo and reconstitute the environment. That's revitalization ritual. And that happened, I believe, at Spiro. And it's not alone. It happened repeatedly. There is Tecumseh, a religious leader. So you see that religion plays an active and vital role in indigenous communities. And just because Europeans got here doesn't mean that this stuff started. I would argue that most of your Calumet pipes, most of your Calumet ceremonies, those are all pre-Columbian ceremonies. This stuff did not just start because Europeans got here to record it. It has a very vibrant and long history. So most of those pipes that are in museums that are made of red catlinite, I would argue, probably go back 1,000 years. And so they're much older. It's much older. There is a huge use of what we call antiquing or heirlooming of items. Found at Spiro were boat stones. Well, we know that those were created in the Archaic period. Those boat stones found at Spiro were probably 6,000 years old, and they were still being used. So that tells you about continuity and culture here in the Americas. That still had relevance. It was important enough to inter in a religious ceremony. So it had purpose. Crystals had purpose. A lot of people don't talk about that. It's a very undervalued, but it's used in fortune telling. Crystals were also used to apply ochre in certain situations where warriors would actually apply a fourth eye motif in red on their face, taking on the power of the falcon into battle, into warfare, used by crystals. So it was a divining element. Crystals were found in a multitude of locations, and Spiro, again, being one of those. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we do know about these religious actions based off of what we know today, but also what we see in the archaeological context.
I want to talk about one of the oldest traditions on the planet, related to human history, especially from religion to even practices before and after engaging in warfare. And that is human sacrifice. From the death pits of ancient Sumer to the bog bodies of Celtic Europe, and even within the civilized communities of Rome and Carthage, and even the Phoenicians, we see its presence. And so now, going from the ancient Near East, going from Europe, going from North Africa, I want to refocus to ancient America and ask, especially in relating to the ancient Mississippians, do we have any evidence of human sacrifice in their world?
Yes, you do. It's not as widespread as you would see it in Mesoamerica, but Cahokia was a perfect example. There was a large interred burial with what would have been sacrificial people. There is the Pawnee Morning Star sacrifice, which occurred every few years. It was associated with a dream, a vision, but it was responsible for giving back to first woman and first man. And so that Pawnee Morningstar sacrifice is actually almost identical to the Maya Popol Vuh and the sacrifice that was performed in the Yucatan. And so, that involved actually the capturing of a young woman, and that they would feast her and celebrate her for a year, and then they would sacrifice her at the end of that period. And so that lasted until the 1830s. And so you do see repeated instances of human sacrifice in North America. Mm-hmm.
As we talk about religion and how we see the past, I would like to ask about the art, whether it be pottery or figurines. What can the art that survives today tell us about ancient Mississippian religion?
Art in the pre-Columbian period probably could be looked at as the physical manifestation of belief. And so you're looking at, through art, in many ways, a pictographic writing system. A narrative is being told within this, because this, just like any religion in the world, gives clues to what is being performed and in what context. Icons and iconography is used in every single religion, from Christianity to Buddhism. Art and icons go hand in hand. And in the Mississippian realm, it certainly plays a role as well. It may play a deeper role in that, maybe through some of these, what we call art, and we use the term art for lack of a better word, but it also does encapsulate what this is, because in my personal belief, I know art because art's what I can't do. And I say that from a point of view that, when you see something that is so masterfully sculpted that your average person can't accomplish it, then in those terms, I accept it as an artistic expression, an artistic belief. But I also accept it here as something that's much more than just aesthetically pleasing. It plays an active role in society. So when you look at the engraved shell, when you looked at the statuary, whether it's done in stone or wood, it's playing a role. It shows a supernatural character. It shows an action that is being performed related to the religious beliefs of the people. And so art plays a critical role. And so it's actually through what we call the Mississippian art, whether it's shell, stone, wood, we're able to actually take those same ideas and motifs that we see there, and they match the historic documentation, the folklore, and the oral traditions that are still being passed on today. More than that, the reason there was a contemporary art section so heavily preferenced in the Spiro exhibition is because these same motifs are still being used today. This is cultural continuation. I mean, these things are still being utilized today. In many instances, this information is lost and forgotten, yet the motif is still being utilized. Or in many cases, the motif is transitioned to give context to resonate in today's world. But it's still motifs that have been used and are still being used today. They never stopped. And this is what's so important. So many times we look at the Mississippians and we look at today. Well, who was Sequoia? Who was Osceola? Who were these people that actually formed and shaped the Cherokee, Muskogee, and Choctaw peoples in the 1800s, the 1700s, that fought for and against the Americans and the British and the French in the multitude of wars that occurred on U.S. soil and American soil? In the Civil War, these people still had ongoing cultural traditions, and they never stopped. And that's important to realize, that the traditions you see today never stopped. And so you want to meet a Mississippian, look around, because they're still here.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today at the Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I was your host, Nick Barksdale, but Dr. Singleton, who truly made this episode, took us on a journey into the past and explored a really obscure subject for me, and a really complicated one, and broke it down, and I hope that you all enjoyed it as much as I did. To my subscribers, I can't encourage you enough. Check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to all of the awesome work Dr. Singleton is doing to help make history matter. Do your part. Check out his work. Give him your full support. And in your own way, you can make history matter as well. And so without further ado, Dr. Singleton, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It is a great pleasure.